training. Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.
Good afternoon, Team Krulak community. My name is Major Ian Brown. I'm the Operations Officer at the Brute Krulak Center for Innovation and Creativity. And on behalf of Marine Corps University, the Marine Corps University Foundation, and the Brute Krulak Center, welcome back to the Brutecast, a series designed to connect the worlds of the warfighter and PME with the best in innovative and creative thought. Before we begin, please remember that all opinions expressed here are those of the individual and do not reflect the views of the Krulak Center, Marine Corps University, the United States Marine Corps, or any other agency of the U.S. government. We will also be recording this webcast for the benefit of our community of interest who could not join us today. So we ask that you be mindful of keeping your microphones muted to avoid disrupting the presentation and turn your webcams off to help us stream smoothly. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will have a question and answer session. So if you have a question, just type it into the group chat and we will get to as many as we can after Dr. Hook and Mr. Marcantonio conclude their presentation. And with that, I'm pleased to turn things over to Dr. Brandon Valeriano, the Krulak Center's Byrne Chair for Military Innovation, who will introduce today's speakers. Over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Major Brown. I'm delighted to introduce two scholars. One of them is a Krulak Fellow to talk to us today about the environment and national security. This is obviously a critical concern. As a hurricane bears down on Louisiana and Texas right now, we have to be aware and concerned about how the environment may affect national security and the missions we all hold at the DoD. Today, we're going to have Dr. Kristina Hook speak to us. She's the Executive Director of the Better Evidence Project at the Center for Peacemaking and Practice at George Mason University's Jimmy and Rosalind Carter School of Peace and Conflict Resolution. Dr. Hook is an anthropologist and a senior practitioner specializing in large-scale violence against civilians, as well as emerging forms of warfare and violence. Prior to her time in academia, Dr. Hook served as a policy advisor for the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations. And then we also have Drew Marcantonio, who's pursuing a joint PhD in peace studies and anthropology at, I assume, Notre Dame. His current research is centered on developing the concept of environmental violence. Prior to beginning his graduate work at Notre Dame, Drew served in the U.S. Marine Corps as infantry officer and a foreign military advisor in Afghanistan. During his graduate studies, he led a research project in Zambia working with small holder farms to understand local perceptions and responses to water scarcity. So I'll turn it over to them, and we'll come back for questions and a Q&A and a greater discussion in a few minutes. Thank you.
All right, well, wonderful. Thank you for the kind introduction there, Dr. Valero, and thanks for everyone for hosting us. Today we're going to talk about war-related environmental crises, risks, and decision-making, and put it into context in the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. I will start by presenting a framework that we will use throughout this presentation and that we've used in other work that we've been working on. That is kind of a heuristic, something that people can use and apply and to try to understand this complex problem or the complex outcomes of the environment in warfare and as a cause of warfare. And then, like I said, we'll apply that to a case study to contextualize it and try and demonstrate how it might be useful to all you folks. So that framework, the next slide, has a couple of different components to it. We can see the environment as a trigger of conflict. It can be a mechanism of control, so the environment can be harnessed to control a population or in different ways, as we'll talk about. We also see that the environment can become degraded in warfare in many different ways, and therefore have very significant health implications, both in the near term and in the long term. We can also talk about the environment as neglected, as not being effectively managed because of ongoing warfare. It takes precedence for certain reasons, but at the same time, the environment then, as it's neglected, can pose both short-term and long-term problems. But all this happens at different scales and at different times, so everything from the highly local to the community that you're working with to across an entire nation or internationally, particularly as pollution knows no boundaries. Certain pollutants move much more easily than others, whether it be through the air, through the water. And so even if it's not the actual area where the conflict is occurring, it can be surrounding areas that we'll talk about. So scale is important to think about, especially as you're leading different units too, for all the folks on active duty who are doing different types of work, thinking about that at the scale that you work at versus the scales that you're higher and others. And also across time, as I talked about again, either acute instances of environmental issues all the way to the more chronic, the long-term and enduring that might last well past the conflict. So the first thing we'll talk about is the environment as a trigger. I'm using this framework of interpretation, implications, and application just to try and make it useful to folks to apply. So think about the environment as a trigger. Oh, sorry, if we can go to the next slide. The interpretation of environment as a trigger to conflict can be triggered due to competition for scarce or abundant environmental resources. Resources such as water, to land as a resource, to more high-value minerals like diamonds, gold, et cetera, that some people refer to as the resource curse, also associated with oil. There's also this idea of resource scarcity, and there's all sorts of global environmental change occurring right now that is making a lot of these things come to light more and producing not always the expected outcomes, which is why I say there's a debate between whether it is scarce resources or abundant resources that lead to conflict, and the general answer is that it's both, because in instances when there's a lot of something available, many people might want to compete over that to then have access to that capital for their own gain, just as if there's a shortage of something, say water, people might be competing over the scarce water resource that's available to use. So both abundance and scarcity can incite conflict, and that's what creates a lot of the debate of does environmental issues cause conflict or not. That's the answer as well. And then thinking about this in application though, say you're doing your IPD, IPOE, intelligence preparation of the operating environment for any sort of planning process. You want to identify what are the key resources of the area of interest that you are operating in, and assessing the institutions that have access to those, who are the stakeholders, who are the people who are dependent on it, how far out does that resource go, both upstream and downstream, and who's tasked with necessarily managing those assets, and are they effectively doing it, et cetera. And you can identify the pressures on that resource, right? So, and are those pressures things you can control? It's a population growth, about controlling that in the short term. In the long term, for other issues, thinking about climate change, if we have increased warming in certain areas, that's going to increase growth rates of crop, whereas in most areas, it's going to decrease growth rates. So how does it affect the access to food for people in the area that you're working in? Is that a possible trigger for conflict? Thinking about all that and then integrating that into a plan for you to manage those in the area that you're responsible for. But that's how we can think about the many different ways in which environmental services or environmental factors can be a trigger for conflict. Move to the next slide. The environment can also be harnessed as a mechanism of control. So environmental resources can be employed as a mechanism of control over a population or group, forcing reliance on and or obedience to the controlling party. And we've seen this in many, many different contexts throughout time. It's definitely nothing new. Really, none of the stuff that I'm going to present to you is necessarily new, but it helps to bring different frameworks and ways to think about light or the current context in which it's changing. Even though it is new, it is just evolving. Right, and so the implications of this is the centrality and availability of different environmental resources, for example, drinking water, which we'll talk about in the Ukrainian context for sure, can increase or decrease the value of a resource that is being used as a mechanism of control. So think about Al-Shabaab often leverages local water resources to control the populations in the villages that they hold, because water is so scarce across Somalia. Another example of this, and we'll talk about this in the Ukrainian context, but a separate issue in Ukraine. Right now, Russia's building a water pipeline to go into Crimea because the Ukrainian government is now allowing access to water to the Crimean Peninsula since it's been annexed. Right? So this is a way that the Russian government will then have control over the water and control the population. Dr. Hook can talk much more about that. But just to think about the implications of that, so we need to identify what are the key resources based on everyday life patterns of the populations that we are working within, the resources available and access to those, and then available adaptive measures or substitutes for those. So if you have a key resource, but there are multiple substitutes available, or you can make a substitute available, right? What does that look like? Then identifying, again, the stakeholders and institutions involved in the management of that resource, deciding who gets to access how much, and also thinking about that as a potential source of corruption, who might be using that as a leverage, or who currently has control that you might consider a legitimate source, but could eventually become a source of corruption as well. And then building that into any of your operational plans. We'll move to the next one. When you think about the environment as degraded, right? So the conduct of war results in a range of both acute and chronic environmental harms and health hazards that can affect the surrounding, and like I mentioned before, distant populations, since pollution does not respect political borders. The implications of this are that environmental hazards produced during warfare, anything from UXO, that people can either step on or is also toxic. So if somebody consumes it accidentally or if it enters the water system, what have you, to heavy metal toxins that are present. We'll talk about the heavy metals inside of abandoned mines or currently being used mines that, because of changes in their management, now pose a significant health risk, right? So that's a little more chronic, whereas UXO is a little more acute today and now. But all of these can produce public health problems that increase the needs of the local population, the services that need to be provisioned for them. And then the duration and the severity of these different hazards mediate the outcomes. So we always think about toxicity, it's dose and exposure. So how long is somebody exposed for and how much really affects what it can do to the human body. And so that also has to be taken into account as well. Recognizing you can't always mitigate all of these, but trying to minimize as much as possible. But thinking about then how do we apply this? So identify the different potential hazards that are going to be, just like when you're talking about your operational risk management, this could be a way to integrate in for degradation, what are the risks available. Well, identifying that, identify the likely impacts and the timelines associated with that, with different forms of degradation, and then developing a plan to mitigate, remediate, or otherwise respond to. So mitigate, preventing, remediate, fixing, or finding some other sort of adaptive mechanism. And then, as I mentioned before, there's the environment and neglect, right? So the idea that if you have warfare ongoing, or high levels of conflict or insecurity, the inability to access an area, you may not be able to provide services needed to actively manage that environment for public health and public good. So environmental management and other related services, for example, waste management, quality of trash going on as we have it here versus many other locations, not exactly the same, but there can be the buildup of waste. And so such things can be directly and indirectly affected by conflict, reducing provision of services, potentially producing environmental risks and harm. Implications of this are that the duration, intensity of a conflict and resultant institutional capacity in the area of interest mediates the effect of the environmental management and service provision with acute and chronic effects, right? So present, what's happening now versus what might happen in the long term. And then the application of this is to identify the different managerial services that might be hindered, right? So anything from utility public water that's being provisioned to, like I mentioned, trash services. You have both of those being harmed, for example, by ongoing warfare. There's a high probability that much of that waste is going to enter the water system. This is why many low socioeconomic areas in the world have what they call the cholera season. The start of the rain season, different places bring all that waste into the water system, and you have significant rates of cholera. Something we want to deal with, but a reality for many millions of people in the world. So you want to assess the effects of this reduction in services of human health in the environment, and then develop a plan again to mitigate, remediate, or manage those environmental risks, whether that be in the short term or the near term. Where that falls into your plan is something you actually have to account for. It tends to be undervalued and not as well understood in the conduct of warfare. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hook.
Great. So I think as we transition to this case study, it's worth stepping back for a moment and really thinking about the process that led us to suggest this framework and reiterate why we think it might be useful for you. Like many people on this call, we find ourselves threading the needle between speed and accuracy when we approach a complex conflict environment. We also find ourselves needing to do research that is relevant for practice. And maybe many of you have felt what I have when I approach a conflict context, which is that you often have so many details that you're trying to fill a teacup with a fire hose. And so often what I felt I needed, especially doing the policy work that I did, was I didn't need more details. I needed frameworks that would help me organize the chaos that was unfolded in such a way that I could take concrete steps to respond. And so these types of conversations are what led Mr. Marcantonio and I to present the framework that he just nicely reviewed. What we did, though, of course, is that the proof is in the pudding. So does this make sense in an actual ongoing conflict environment? The data that we'll now present to you is data that emerged over 2.5 years of ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted in Ukraine from 2015 to 2019. At that time, I began hearing from Ukrainian colleagues and investigative journalists who would travel to Eastern Ukraine that they were hearing really serious stories of environmental risk, environmental degradation, and even very dark stories of what might come next. So after a period of interviewing, we were able to have a privileged review of some of the data that Ukrainian colleagues, as well as international organizations like the OSCE, have collected in this context. As you'll see in the next 2 slides, I really would encourage always refreshing the data that I present regarding the conflict context. It is very fluid, It changes a lot, and the information presented on the next two slides is from the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. We've got a few moments of time. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. We've got a little bit of time, so I think it's really worth going into some of the technical details of what's unfolding in Ukraine regarding the environment. So the conflict, as you saw previously, is occurring in the east on two provinces that are collectively referred to as the Donbas region. These regions are heavily industrial. The name itself signifies rich coal deposits that are found in the river basin, and the coal basin constitutes a geographic expanse of 500 kilometers that stretch from the Dnipro River to the Don rivers in modern-day Ukraine as well as modern-day Russia. The estimates put the total area at 60,000 kilometers squared. So as a reference point, the Ruhr coal basin in Germany is 13 times smaller. So we're talking about a very large area. Furthermore, the Donbas area has been and continues to be a highly industrialized area. It has resulted in a sprawl of active industrial production facilities and the remnants of inactive sites and facilities. This context is unique. Unlike many contexts currently underway around the world and in recent history, this conflict is happening in and around the industrial complexes, which exposes these sites to destruction from fighting, significantly increasing potential environmental risks. One thing to note here is that the Donbas region is home to one of the world's largest coal mining regions, which prior to the conflict was one of the main sources of energy for the entire country of Ukraine. In fact, 90% of Ukrainian coal comes from the Donetsk Oblast in the south of this region. The production of coal and other materials in the Donbas is critical to the functioning of the Ukrainian state and has some significant implications for this conflict, a point that I'll return to. One other point, just to give you a broader snapshot of the context that we're looking at, the Donbas area has 900 active and inactive mines, according to estimates by the Ukrainian Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources. This includes both surface and subsurface mining. In total, 15 billion metric tons of coal and 9 billion metric tons of rock have been extracted from the ground of this region. 9 billion cubic meters of subsurface galleries have also been constructed. Surface mines produce extensive environmental harm as they are exposed to erosive and transporting elements such as rainfall and wind. This is something that is seen around the world in these sites and is also present in Ukraine. Additionally, the subsurface mines in Donbas are very deep. They average 720 meters with a range of 220 meters to 1,380 meters deep. And close to the surface waters, this results in them being in proximity to and exposed to groundwater flows that can percolate into the mine shafts, requiring active pumping to mitigate these associated risks. The subsurface of the Donbas region is rich in methane gas content, making mining in this area significantly more risky and increasing the environmental impact of subsurface mining with an estimated release of up to 6 billion meters cubed per year of methane. All of this is saying that the Donbas region has in total, even prior to the conflict, led to an accumulation of environmentally risky indicators. It's a site of pollutants ranging from heavy metal toxins to industrial chemical pollution. Prior to the current conflict, which began in 2014 in this area, there were 4,220 sites that were designated as hazardous. And as you can imagine, with now 6 years of conflict, these risks have increased. This is a summary of some of the things that I just overlaid, and because I threw so many details at, I'll just hit these again. I talked about this environmental crisis unfolding in the east. The conflict in Ukraine also involves the Crimean Peninsula. We will primarily focus this presentation on the east. As I mentioned, one of the main issues is this intricately connected underground mines. They're flooding the area in these underground tunnels, and that is significant for this conflict because the flooding of mines requires action by both sides of the contact line. This is not something that only one actor could tackle alone. What is also very significant, and one of the issues that captured our attention at the beginning of this project, was the threat of nuclear and other contamination, and the fact that this was believed to be rising, which is putting millions of people in Ukraine, Russia, and elsewhere at risk. As I began doing some of the preliminary talks for this project, I spoke with a man named Yevhen Yakovlev. He is the chief researcher at Kiev's Institute of Telecommunications and Global Information Space. And he told me, quote, Ukraine is standing before, first of all, an ecological catastrophe more deep and dangerous than Chernobyl. When he said that, he has some right to do so, as he was one of the liquidators of Chernobyl, had tried to warn the Soviet government as a Soviet researcher prior to the explosion. As we looked at the data, though, we saw that the risks were beyond even this very dramatic risk. They're difficult to forecast precisely, but the potential for an imminent, severe ecological disaster is real. This event would have a lasting, uncontrollable impact. It would disrupt political borders that are already contested. It continues to paralyze current leadership regimes. We've looked at data across the Ukrainian Poroshenko and Zelensky administration. There is very little movement because it is such a challenge, and it is denied by the Russian Federation. And it also will cause an enormous amount of human health risks. Next slide. This is just a quick visual of the underground mines, really stressing the point that the flooding of underground tunnels is not something that a sole actor working on either the non-government controlled side or the government controlled side could tackle alone. And the picture on the left is one of the pictures of one of the pumping sites, and it's just meant to sort of put a visual in your mind when we talk about why these sites are so difficult to access now. So as I said, when we were looking at what's really useful in understanding this context, we were looking at a framework that might help us to organize these risks without saying that an environmental crisis necessarily falls into only one category. So what we did was we took the 4 risk areas that my colleague has just overlaid for you, and we looked at how these applied in the Ukrainian context and asked ourselves, is this helping us to clarify the situation? Is this helping us to organize risk? And from there, how would this help us to organize the type of policies that might be most needed? So first of all, looking at this topic of environmental triggers in the Ukrainian context. Currently, we would say that the conflict was not caused by a direct fight for resource access, something that has driven other conflicts in the world. However, once the conflict began, resources played a critical role. Specifically, the coal deposits were critical to the Ukrainian state, as I mentioned. They're also critical to the separatists. It's believed that the separatists receive funding from the Russian Federation, but another source of funding can obviously come from resources. Alternative energy exploration was signed into law by the Ukrainian government. This was specifically for the purpose of trying to avoid funding the separatist forces, and it resulted in Donbass coal being exported abroad. So thus, while resources were not a direct causal mechanism in initiating the conflict, they were integral in preserving the conflict dynamics by funding separatist forces and by incentivizing the Ukrainian state to regain access. Again, we looked at environmental degradation in this context. So the first thing we note here is that there was a proliferation of unexploded ordnance. So these devices would fail to detonate, or they would partially detonate, depositing toxic explosive materials in and around the targeted area. They also leached toxic chemicals into the surrounding soil and waters, preventing effective environmental management. Another issue we looked at this degradation category was the emplacement of mines. These degrade over time, depositing again toxic chemicals into the soil, while also significantly reducing the ability to manage this environmental crisis. In the short term, the OSCE estimated that approximately 50 lives were lost per month, but in the long term, again, it's the degradation to soil, to groundwater, to surface water, and to land use. Continuing the theme of degradation, there was a third area we looked at from this data, and that was the destruction of infrastructure as a function of the artillery and munitions bombardment. From this category, there are several implications. The first is that it produces a hazardous air pollution emissions. Again, this has short and long-term impacts, which is really a theme of this conflict and environmental issues. These issues range from early death to Alzheimer's risk. In the Luhansk Oblast, data showed itchy and watery eyes. It showed an increase in respiratory diseases, headache, and nausea linked to smoldering facilities. Second, this disabled trash and wastewater removal. So this untreated wastewater was entering the surface water. The municipal water systems were destroyed by artillery fire. The pipes were damaged from the kinetic conflict activity, and the pumping and treatment systems were no longer operated. Furthermore, the Donetsk River became highly contaminated. Specifically, fecal chloroform was 10 times the standard set by the 2010 Sanitary Norms and Rules Act, which was established by the Ukrainian government 4 years before the conflict began. The long-term impacts are likely to exist far longer than the active violence itself, and we would note that as a 6-year conflict, the length of the active fighting is itself quite lengthy. Passing now to the third issue we looked at environmental neglect and how did this play out in the context. Here we note that the Ukrainian Ministry of Ecology and Natural Resources monitored, regulated, and managed more than 900 active and inactive mines. This was something for any government to tackle. It is even a bigger issue for a government that prior to the conflict had noted capacity challenges. These mines pose significant risks to soil, water, and air quality, such as high methane and radon content. Prior to the conflict, the ministry also saw a rather staggering 2.2 billion liters per day of groundwater to prevent the subsurface mine shafts from being flooded. So prior to the conflict, there was an enormous amount on their plate, and the conflict has significantly worsened their ability on the government-controlled side to manage, and really resulted in an ecological black hole across that contact line. Now, 200 mines are believed to be at risk due to flooding due to the proximity of the subsurface groundwater aquifers and flows. Again, we want to note that these flooded mines can introduce pollutants that range from minerals that increase water's hardness or salinity to heavy metal toxins such as mercury, lead, and arsenic. The concern was amplified, as we mentioned, because due to the Soviet history and legacy in this area where nuclear tests were carried out, several mines posed risk of radioactive contamination. And again, this is data that is very challenging now in the current context to really see clearly what's happening, because anything for both governments involved in this conflict that has to do with nuclear legacies automatically becomes classified. It also becomes very complicated for scientists on either side of this conflict, so either Ukrainian, Russian, or even any remaining scientists in the Donbas region itself to share data. These sites were surveyed by the Ukrainian Ministry of Ecology in 2016. At that time, 35 mines were found with stopped groundwater pumping and flowing. So the total groundwater pumping was noted at 1.4 billion, and it's likely much less now. Continuing the theme of neglect, we were also looking at the interaction of all of these factors working together. So to summarize, the deterioration of mine management and pumping, the flooding of subsurface mines, and the surface water contamination. And all of this working together significantly decreased water standards. Again, we were looking at this 2016 survey and speculating about what might be found today. In 2016, 35 sites were tested on the government-controlled side, and 26 sites were surveyed in the non-government controlled areas. Prior to the conflict, these sites all presented potable water, which is why they were chosen. Now, 30 out of 35 in the GCA areas and 25 out of 26 in the NGCA areas were listed as contaminated or non-potable. With water being such a significant need, and as my colleague has already mentioned, a significant mechanism of control, this is a really sobering finding. Before we move on, I also want to note that 3 sites near inactive mines with subsurface nuclear detonations also had significant radiation levels exceeding the Donbas baseline. As you can see with the numbers listed here, these are very high. We've also included US EPA data that shows multi-year exposure levels is recommended not to exceed. So really considering the short-term symptoms that are being presented here as well as the long-term, this is sobering data. The ministry also estimated that 87,000 meters cubes of contaminated mine water were released every hour, and that methane and radon release rates increased substantially. So as I sort of foreshadowed in my comments, the issue of environmental control in the Ukrainian context has to be looked at as well. Here, we started out looking at degradation and neglect that incentivize control over the remaining resources, especially fuel, primarily coal. As a country that has significant heating challenges in the winter, coal is very important both for the civilian population as well as a financial resource for both sides. Water is also a very important resource here. Many municipal water facilities were destroyed or non-functional. As local clean water sources decreased, the importation of water will become necessary, resulting in a new and very lucrative mechanism of control over the population. The separatist export of coal also reduced the financial dependence on local factors. So again, really impacting the types of dynamics that can lead to successful negotiation, really impacting the relationship of local governance between the separatist authorities and the civilian populations under their control. This allows them to exert more control over the local population and also to distribute the resources that are very needed in this area for cooking, for heating, and for energy to the parties that they select. Factors that increase the separatist control over the population were very significant because the Ukrainian government has little to no access to their population over the line of the conflict, and they have little to no access to provide essential services. This is something that is also contributing to an increasing expressions of alienation by the civilian population in this area to the Kyiv government. There are physical and psychological impacts of this failure, and it is a significant conflict driver. So that wraps up the initial remarks we wanted to say. We are also very open to hearing both your questions as well as any comments that you might have about how this resource would be useful to you or suggestions that you have for improving it.
Sure. One of the things we found most valuable about trying to build this framework is it's broad. It doesn't try and necessarily predict exactly it's not a predictive model, but a model that can be applied to current context at hand for people that are engaging these issues. Because the research is very inconclusive, mostly because if we look at predictive modeling, there's so much, well, it depends. There's a lot of human influence that mediates whether conflict's going to be an outcome or not, or whether a particular resource is going to end up being used or not. And then the knowledge for that local area versus trying to use a model that is collective data, so a large data set to try and do predictive modeling of where this conflict is going to occur based on different resources. There's very few things that have been so definitively tied that we can say with certainty, yes, this is going to be the outcome. More often than not, it's mediated by a lot of control variables, whether that, again, be socioeconomic status of places, a number of adaptive mechanisms available, those types of things. So we tried to build a model that was going to be useful for people, both practitioners, researchers, folks on the ground dealing with these issues, kind of a whole host, without it being overly prescriptive and acknowledging the limitations of the model. In my own work, I apply similar things to think about. So I respond with a group, an international disaster relief organization, to disaster sites immediately following them to provide relief work. And I apply a similar framework to think about what could potentially happen that we need to be mitigating here in this area as a function of the loss of environmental services, the amount of environmental damage that's occurred, all of the socio-political institutions that exist, et cetera. And so that kind of model works here. A different set of work, though, what I do is a lot of environmental analytics and look at changes in the environment from human-produced toxic pollution emissions. And with that, I look at, and I mentioned this earlier, that we talk about how many people are dying as a function of warfare and other causes. Really, toxic pollution is the number one cause of death in the world, particularly particulate matter that's emitted, but many other sources as well. And a lot of it, we're seeing that this is being exported. If it's produced in a country, a lot of it ends up being produced from another country doing operations in that country, or it can be leaving a country's borders, right? So if you eat salmon that's collected from, or that's been harvested in Alaska here in the U.S., it's highly likely that that salmon is contaminated with mercury emitted from coal factories in China. And all that coal is then coming back to the U.S. This kind of circular linkage that occurs. But if we're thinking about what is harming people, particularly harming Americans, since that tends to be the audience focus here, there are many ways in which we are seeing increased rates of risk and harm as a function of the emissions that we are producing, whether it be greenhouse gas emissions or toxic pollution emissions, which can come from the same sources, but there's lots of different processes for those. And I think that's something that the DoD is going to end up having to really focus on and think about, considering how many people are dying of this. In the U.S. alone, it's 200,000 people a year. In China, it's about 1.4 million people a year. So there are varying rates, of course, but think that's one of the future challenges and threats that we will face in national security that isn't necessarily, and actually isn't well thought about in the DoD currently.
So I asked my colleague to go first too, because with all of that good technical recommendations made, I think that there's a broader picture too with one of the ways that I have learned from this context of why this matters in the work that I do. And that is the connection of environmental issues and revealing some emerging patterns of asymmetric conflict, particularly types of asymmetric conflict that I think we see emerging and that I think are going to be used, these strategies used really heavily already by Russia as well as by China. So one of the other papers that we did was we went in asking the question of, okay, for a conflict zone, environmental issues, that should be something that is easy to get technical assistance on, it's difficult sometimes to get political will on more sensitive types of humanitarian aid, but what's going on here? And so we did a lot of extensive interviewing and wrote another article on asking, so why the Ukrainian government wasn't able to get access to these areas. That's more straightforward. They can't get access. Why Russia is not involved, because if these issues emerge, it's going to impact their citizens immediately in the Rostov province, but then also in Russia in wider areas. Why Russia couldn't do anything to sort of put pressure on separatists that they were able to successfully pressure in other ways. And that essentially boiled down to the fact that they are not willing to admit that they are active in this environmental issue because it's a hybrid warfare. It's an undeclared warfare in this space. So what does that mean? Why weren't European partners, particularly the Scandinavians who have provided various forms of technical assistance, humanitarian aid? Scandinavians really like funding environmental efforts. So what was going on there? Again, it led to this fact that this is an undeclared war and is falling through the cracks in international law terminology in a lot of ways. The Scandinavian technical assistance partners were not confident that they could provide aid that could be monitored by a formal government in any way. And so really beginning to look at how these patterns of warfare, how international law is going to be changing, and then applying that, looking at, so I focus on Eastern Europe and Russia, so looking at how Russia behaves in Central African Republic, in Venezuela, in Libya, in Syria, and then looking at the ways that some of these actions are falling between the international and humanitarian law cracks, how this relates to environmental issues, as well as to a host of ways that the national security apparatus in the U.S. is going to need to engage countries that are doing these things.
And about your work, what you have coming up?
So as mentioned, I am the executive director of something called the Better Evidence Project at the Carter School at George Mason. So it's a new initiative, just recently funded, and it is looking to do research that is effective and practical for policy and practice applied practitioners. What I do in my other hat as a researcher is I focus on a lot of these issues that involve Russia in one way or the other. With my language skills, I do a lot with the Ukrainian conflict, publish a lot there. I look at how different actors in the Ukrainian context use similar terminology to describe what's going on and how that drives political decision making. I'd like to scale that project up and use the model that I created to look at how opaque conditions in complex contexts really unfold. So, the sort of official talking points by governmental actors are one thing to the world, but how can we have a model for looking at sort of linguistic cues or cultural cues or identity-based cues? What does that tell us cross-culturally about how the interplay of international and domestic factors drive conflict? And then as well, looking at Russian activities around the world, looking at how they use private military contractors and trying to understand how these gaps in international humanitarian law are going to change civilian protection policies, and asking if we as the U.S. national security apparatus are aware and tracking some of these emerging challenges.
Great, all critical questions. Drew, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure. So I'm still continuing to work with this international disaster relief organization. Business is good, unfortunately. But I also work tracking illegal mining operations across the African continent, predominantly in West Africa, and unfortunately there as well. That's the side of looking at the production of toxic pollution. And I'm also growing that to look domestically inside of the U.S. now. The distribution of toxic pollution throughout the country and the risk of some of those sites to the effects of the growing effects of climate change, particularly from coastal inundation. So a couple of different ways to triangulate human-produced environmental risks, both domestically and internationally, and then the drivers of those risks.
Great, thank you. Back to you, Major Brown.
All right, Dr. Valeriano, thank you very much. And to Dr. Hook and Judy, thanks for joining us on this week's broadcast. Definitely a unique topic that we haven't had on here before. So appreciate your time joining us for this afternoon. So thank you to the rest of our audience for tuning in this week. Next week, we'll be taking off for the long weekend, but we want to make sure you join us back here on September 10th when we'll be hosting two of our non-resident fellows for a transatlantic episode. Dr. Amy Fox of King's College London and Dr. Heather Venable of the Air Force's Air Command and Staff College will discuss innovations and institutional changes in the British Army and United States Marine Corps in the era of the First World War. We'll see you all then. Thank you.
Education is what's important. Training, preparation for the expected. Education, preparation for the unexpected.